Imagine a gang of thieves pulling off the biggest bank heist in American history. The operation was a success, executed with the highest level of precision and professionalism. The clever and complex steps they took during the heist proved that these thieves were on a whole other level. So, how could a group of professional and meticulous thieves like these ever get caught? Is it possible that smart thieves like them could be caught because of trivial mistakes? That's what we'll find out in today's story. Hello everyone, I'm Bader. The events of our story took place in the city of Los Angeles, California, in 1972, which is about 50 years ago. Specifically on Monday, March 27th. The manager of a large branch of United California Bank headed in, as he did every morning, to open the bank vault. But when the manager tried to open the vault door, the door wouldn't budge. The handle was circular, the kind you need to turn to move the gears inside the massive steel door to open it. But no matter how hard the manager tried to turn the handle refused to move. The employees came and gathered in front of the door, and several of them tried to turn the handle, but to no avail. The door was stuck. The very next step was to contact the company that manufactured the vault, as they were responsible for its maintenance. The technician from the company arrived 20 minutes after the call and began examining the vault and checking its lock in an attempt to find out why it wouldn't open. The technician kept trying and trying for several hours, but with no luck. The combination was correct. The lock was in place, and everything outwardly seemed normal and in perfect order. There was no explanation for why the vault door was malfunctioning. Then the technician suggested going up to the space above the vault, meaning this is the bank's ceiling, and below it is the vault ceiling. And there's a small space between them supported by wooden beams where ventilation pipes and electrical wiring run. Of course, the ceiling of this vault is a thick concrete slab reinforced with steel. So imagine the technician's shock when he saw a large hole in the vault ceiling. And above it, there was also a second hole in the ceiling of the bank building itself. Right then, the technician knew immediately that the vault had been robbed, and that the thief or thieves had cut a hole in the bank building's roof, followed by a second hole in the vault ceiling. That thick, steel-reinforced concrete ceiling. The technician immediately went down into the vault through the hole, and the first thing he noticed was the massive amount of dust covering everything inside the vault. And of course, everything inside the vault was turned upside down, the shelves, the bags, the safety deposit boxes, everything had clearly been looted, and when he went to check the vault door from the inside, he immediately noticed a screwdriver jammed between the door gears to keep it from opening. And of course, it was clear the thieves' goal was to delay the discovery of the robbery for as long as possible. So the technician removed the screwdriver, and they were able to open the vault door right away. Immediately after that, the bank called the police, and officers and investigators arrived, entered the vault, and began examining the scene. The vault was turned upside down, and everything in it was looted. The scene was a total mess, and many things were scattered on the floor: watches, rings, photos, documents, and many belongings, all belonging to the safety deposit box owners. Of course, the thieves surely tried to take the most valuable items and left behind things that were worthless or of little value. The investigators knew that organizing the place and determining the extent of losses and thefts would take a lot of effort and a long time. And they also had to quickly find out how these thieves managed to enter this vault, which was supposed to be impenetrable and very secure from all sides. So the first thing they noticed when they examined the debris left by the opening was that the concrete dust was mixed with other strange materials, which shouldn't be construction materials or things found in ceiling concrete. For example, there was black-colored dirt, and also large pieces of burlap cloth, torn and scattered in several places inside the vault. This black dirt was most likely gunpowder residue. But the question the investigators were most puzzled by was how the alarms didn't go off when the thieves broke into the vault. This vault had several alarm systems. The first alarm was a large bell mounted on the bank's exterior wall. This bell was supposed to ring loudly if the alarm system detected intruders. But when they opened the bell's box, they found it covered in a hard white substance that prevented it from moving or making any sound. They also found a metal ladder in a spot very close to the bank wall. So with all this evidence, the investigators were able to form a clear picture of how the thieves broke into the bank. First, they picked the lock on the alarm bell box, and then they sprayed it with liquid styrofoam. This material is a construction substance that, as soon as it leaves the can, starts to harden and turns from a liquid to a solid state. So once this material hardened and became solid, it would freeze the alarm bell's hammer and prevent it from moving. So the alarm bell wouldn't ring. Then they brought the long metal ladder and climbed to the roof of the bank building with their drills and special digging and cutting tools. And they used an electrical extension from the building itself to power these tools. They had a long cable, so they were easily able to connect their tools to the power. Then they drilled the first hole in the roof of the bank building, which wasn't that fortified or strong. And after they entered through this hole and breached the bank's roof, they were in the small area between the bank's roof and the roof of the vault itself. But as we said, this vault's roof was going to be much harder because it's a thick concrete roof reinforced with iron. But before they started their work on the vault's roof, there was a second alarm system located directly above the vault. This alarm system was a silent one. As soon as it detects any breach of the vault, it's supposed to send a signal to the police immediately. So the thieves knew about this alarm system, even though it was a hidden alarm. No one was supposed to know about it except the bank management and the police. Which means the thieves had planned and studied the matter meticulously. On top of that, it's clear that one of them was an expert in alarm systems. Because after investigators examined this device, they found that the thieves cut the wires that were supposed to trigger the alarm signal and send it to the police. And then they soldered these wires together in a way that wouldn't let any signal come out of this device. I mean, these thieves were at the highest level of professionalism and knew exactly what they were doing. I mean, this wasn't an ordinary operation. This was a precise operation that required high skills. But even after they disabled the alarm system, now they were faced with the toughest challenge, which is the concrete vault roof that's 40 centimeters thick and reinforced with iron. So how do you breach this? If you want to drill through it, you'd need days and maybe weeks, even if you use the strongest drills and drilling equipment. This is where the team's explosives expert came in. The thieves made small holes with drills, and into these holes they lowered sticks of dynamite. A very clever way, and it might be the only way to open a hole in a strong roof like this. But the explosion had to be directed downwards towards the roof so it wouldn't hurt the thieves or attract attention. So the investigators' conclusion was that the thieves had brought burlap bags filled with sand. And they had, brought a large quantity of them. So they placed these burlap bags over the explosives and the dynamite holes and covered them tightly. So when they detonated the dynamite, these bags directed the explosion downwards. All the force of the explosion hit the vault's roof. And the added benefit was that the sound didn't travel outside. But even after they blew up the roof and opened the hole, the explosion didn't destroy the iron supports inside the concrete. But the thieves knew this and had planned for it. So they had brought an acetylene torch with them, the tool that blacksmiths use to cut iron. And using this torch, they were able to cut through these iron supports. I mean, these thieves were prepared for everything, knowing every step and every tool they needed. They didn't miss even the smallest detail. An operation planned with the highest level of professionalism and precision. And that's what left the investigators stunned, shocking them more than anything else. Now that the investigators knew the details of how the thieves breached the vault, it was time to search for any traces they might have left behind. But they knew that thieves who carried out such a precise operation couldn't have left any traces behind. And indeed, after searching the place multiple times, they found no fingerprints, no DNA, nor any useful trace. The only thing they found was a glove that apparently belonged to one of the thieves. And they also found a drill bit. But none of these items had any traces or anything useful they could use. The next task was to assess the scale of the stolen goods. The bank said that $50,000 in cash had disappeared from the vault. But this amount was trivial compared to the valuables that were in the safety deposit boxes. And it's clear the thieves forced these boxes open. And since the robbery happened over the weekend, the thieves had plenty of time to open these boxes, search them, and sort through their contents. Naturally, they took the valuables and left behind useless items like photos or documents. Things that were surely important to the box owners, but meant nothing to the thieves because they weren't valuable. Of course, the bank doesn't know what's inside these boxes. The people who own these boxes are the only ones who know what's inside. So the police had to interview all the box owners to estimate the extent of the losses. Of course, these boxes were full of jewelry, watches, bonds, and even cash. So after the police interviewed dozens of the box owners, they estimated the value of the stolen items at $8 million, which meant this was the biggest bank robbery in all of American history. Of course, there were bigger ones later, but at the time, this was the biggest robbery. So imagine, these investigators are facing the biggest bank robbery in American history, and they don't have a single piece of evidence or a lead to follow. So they started thinking about what they could do. And the first thing that came to mind was to try and track the tools the thieves used. They knew most of the tools used from their analysis of the robbery. The thieves used massive drills, cables, sandbags, and dynamite, as well as blacksmithing tools, so the police started visiting shops in the area that might sell such tools or the materials used to make them. So they went to the shop owners and asked them about any recent purchases that might be considered suspicious. But this attempt of theirs ended in failure. They didn't find anything useful. The investigators were stumped, not knowing what to do. There was no evidence, no witnesses, and no suspects. It was as if these thieves had pulled off the perfect heist that was impossible to solve. So at this point, the case was handed over to the FBI. And when the FBI takes on a case, you know the culprit is in serious trouble. As soon as the FBI investigators learned the details of the heist, they immediately realized they were dealing with professional thieves with extensive experience in the field. But this was the first bank robbery of this professional caliber in the city of Los Angeles. So the only conclusion was that these thieves were from another state or city. So the first thing the FBI office in Los Angeles did was send a message to all the other FBI offices across the United States. This message explained the details of the robbery that had occurred and asked if any other FBI offices in other cities had dealt with similar cases or this level of professionalism. The response came quickly from the FBI office in the state of Ohio. The FBI office in Ohio said they were actually investigating and tracking 13 robberies similar to the one in Los Angeles. The investigators in the Ohio office, as soon as they heard the details of the robbery, such as the use of liquid styrofoam to freeze the alarm and breaking into the bank through the roof, as well as bypassing the silent alarm and using explosives. These were all details very similar to the robberies they were investigating in the state of Ohio. The FBI office in Ohio believed that those responsible for these robberies were actually a large gang linked to organized crime and the mafia, and their headquarters was in Youngstown, Ohio. So the Los Angeles investigators were actually right. This was a gang of professional bank robbers, and the Ohio office already had a large list of about 100 people involved in this gang. This gang was very large, and it had different teams and crews, and each team would carry out its own operations, and they might sometimes help each other and benefit from each other's expertise. They had specialists for everything. Some specialized in drilling, electricity, metalwork technology, and explosives. All the expertise they needed for these operations was within the gang. So depending on the operation and its requirements, a special team or crew might be formed to carry out a specific operation. Now the question is, if the FBI office in Ohio has all this information about these individuals, about the members of this large gang, why don't they arrest them? The answer is quite simple, because there's no conclusive evidence. They couldn't make the charges stick to them. But their investigations and intelligence are what led them to this list. So the FBI office in Ohio was confident that the gang that robbed the bank in Los Angeles were among the members of this large gang they were tracking. So they sent this gang list to the FBI office in Los Angeles. This list contained the names and photos of all the gang members the office knew about. Of course, since this gang is based in Ohio, it means they likely arrived in Los Angeles by plane, because the distance between Ohio and Los Angeles is over 3,500 kilometers. So it's almost impossible that they covered it by car. So now their task was to compare the list of gang members' names with the passenger lists of those who arrived from Ohio to Los Angeles during the period preceding the robbery. Now, this process was very tedious because there were no computers at that time. We're in the year 1972. So they had to review these lists manually. But finally, after a great effort, they were able to identify 6 gang members who entered Los Angeles shortly before the robbery was carried out. These people are as follows: Emil Dincio and his brother James Dincio, and his brother-in-law Charles Mulligan, Philip Christopher, Charles Brockels, and Harry Barber. I'll number them from 1 to 6, as shown in front of you, to make them easier to remember. Of course, all these gang members had prior criminal records involving burglaries of homes and small shops. And they were all imprisoned for short periods during their lives. But none of them had been arrested for a major robbery or spent a long time in prison. As for number 1, who is Emil Dencio, he was apparently the leader and mastermind of the operation. He's the one who chose the rest of the gang members. And if you notice, he even brought a number of his relatives with him. Number 2 is named James Dencio, and he is, in fact, his older brother. And number 3, who is Charles Mulligan, is actually his brother-in-law and his sister's husband. These two don't have specific expertise, and most likely their task was the manual labor. As for number 4, Philip Christopher, he had skilled in surveillance and reconnaissance. And he was likely responsible for surveillance and ensuring that no one interrupted them during the operation. Especially since this bank robbery they pulled off actually spanned the entire weekend. It lasted through Saturday and Sunday. So they were going in and out of the vault multiple times. So this whole thing required surveillance. And that was Philip Christopher's job. As for number 5, Charles Brockel, he was the most important member of the team. This man is an electronics and explosives expert. And he was the one responsible for disabling the alarm systems. And he was also responsible for planting the explosives. And the last one, number 6, who is Harry Barber? He is actually the nephew of the leader, Emil. So his role was likely also the manual labor. These 6 all arrived in Los Angeles shortly before the robbery, which undoubtedly made them the main suspects in the case. Now, the problem was that investigators didn't know where to look for them. The only idea they had was to go to the airport and ask taxi drivers if they'd seen any of them, because these suspects likely took a taxi after leaving the airport. Investigators interviewed all the taxi drivers who were working at the airport that day. So this was a very large and massive operation, and it took several days as they questioned dozens of taxi drivers. But finally, these massive efforts led to a result. One of the taxi drivers, after seeing the photos shown by investigators, said that a group of 5 people who looked like those in the photos rode with him that day. And he said he remembered this trip perfectly because they gave him a $100 tip. Which, of course, was a very large tip. On top of that, the taxi driver said they looked suspicious, as if they were actually gang members. Investigators took the address the taxi driver gave them, which was a house in one of the city's suburbs. Investigators were afraid that if the suspects knew the FBI was after them, they might immediately leave the city and disappear. But after thinking it over, they had no choice but to head to this house. It was the only lead they could follow. So they decided to go to the house. And when they arrived, they knocked on the door. When the door opened, a man came out. And after they identified themselves and asked him some questions, they learned that this house belonged to the Barber family, and that this person talking to them was actually named Ronald Barber. And he's the younger brother of Harry Barber, suspect number 6, whom we talked about earlier. Investigators didn't have a search warrant or anything, so they couldn't enter the house or search the place. And they couldn't arrest anyone. But they asked Ronald Barber if they could ask him some questions, meaning conduct an interview with him, and Ronald Barber agreed. But despite his agreement, it was clear he was being evasive in his answers. He kept saying, "I don't know," or giving unclear answers. When investigators asked him about the 6 gang members, he said they did come to the house but didn't stay. Each of them went somewhere else to finish their business. And when they asked him what business they had, he said, "I don't know." After they finished their questions, investigators thanked Ronald Barber for his cooperation and left. And although they were sure he was lying to them about some things, they believed him on the point that these 6 didn't stay at the house, which likely meant they went to a hotel. And it's very possible they even stayed in different hotels. The investigators' first instinct was to check the hotels near the bank. They fanned out and started visiting every high-end hotel in the area. But their search didn't yield any results, until one of the investigators decided to think outside the box. Maybe these thieves didn't stay at the best hotels. Maybe they stayed in ordinary or even low-budget hotels to avoid drawing attention. This investigator started looking for those types of hotels and visited them one by one. And finally, his efforts paid off when he entered a small roadside motel typically used by truck drivers. When the investigator showed photos of the suspects to the receptionist, the clerk pointed to the photo of Emil Dencio, the gang leader, and also pointed to the photo of his brother-in-law, Charles Mulligan. and said that these two individuals had been staying at the hotel. When the investigator asked about the time they were staying there, he learned it was around the date the bank was robbed. Then, the investigator asked the clerk to show him the registration forms they filled out when they checked into the hotel. The investigator immediately noticed that Emil Dincio had used a license plate number on the forms. And when they searched for this plate, they tracked it and found it belonged to Ronald Barber, who is his nephew, the person they interviewed when they arrived at the house, and who is the brother of suspect number 6. So now, Ronald Barber was added as suspect number 7 in the case. And Ronald Barber joined his brother, Harry Barber, on the list. FBI investigators were almost certain that these 7 were responsible for the robbery, but they didn't have any conclusive evidence that could be used against them in court. All the evidence was circumstantial, inferential evidence, so now they needed a new lead to follow. So here, the FBI did something very important, even though they initially thought it wouldn't lead to anything. This thing was that they asked the telecommunications authority to give them the call logs made from the hotel room phone where the suspect stayed. The investigators didn't think they would find anything useful, because thieves are supposed to, especially the leader Emil, be careful and not use phones that the police could track or trace their calls on. But it seems that Emil didn't expect the investigators to reach the hotel where they stayed. They thought they had covered their tracks perfectly. So indeed, Emil used the hotel room phone and made several calls. You might ask, well, why didn't he use his cell phone? I'll remind you again that we are in the year 1972. There were no cell phones at that time. Anyway, when the investigators received the list of these calls made from the hotel room phone, they noticed an important number, a number that Emil called repeatedly. And this number was local to Los Angeles. So when they tracked this number, they found it belonged to a house owned by someone named Earl Dawson. And when they conducted their investigation into this Earl Dawson, they found that he was a former Special Forces soldier. And he was also an explosives expert. And since the thieves used explosives in the operation, investigators began to suspect that he was involved with them. It's true they already had an explosives expert, Charles Brockles. But maybe this Earl Dawson was the one who provided the explosives. But after looking into his background and life more, they felt it was unlikely. His record was clean, and he even seemed like a patriotic man, with a stable and comfortable life. He didn't need to get involved in gang work and robberies. So the investigators decided to go to his house and confront him directly. They went to the house, and when he opened the door, they introduced themselves and asked for an interview. Earl Dawson agreed and let them into the house. Right away, the investigators brought it up and showed him names and photos of the suspects, asking him directly about his relationship with them. At first, Dawson was a bit hesitant to speak. The investigators, of course, knew he'd served in the Army and Special Forces. So one investigator, also a former Special Forces officer, tried to connect with him through patriotism and military service. It seems this had an effect on Dawson and got him talking. So Dawson asked the investigator what it was about. Why are you looking for these people? The investigator said, have you heard about the big bank robbery a few weeks ago? That's what we're talking about. Then Dawson took the photos of the suspects in front of him and pointed to 3 of them, saying he knew these 3, Emil Dincio, his brother James Dincio, and his brother-in-law Charles Mulligan. Charles Mulligan in particular was the one he knew best because they were friends and had a strong bond from his time in Ohio, specifically in Youngstown, which is the hub for this gang. So Dawson decided to tell the investigators everything he knew, telling them that the day before the robbery, Charles Mulligan knocked on his door, and he had 6 other people with him, the same 6 in the photos in front of him. Then Mulligan offered him $100 to leave his house so they could have a private meeting inside. So Dawson said okay, took the $100, left the house, and let them be. And of course, he didn't hear what they discussed inside the house. Then Dawson surprised the investigators even more when he said he had something important for them to see. The investigators asked him, what is it? Dawson told them Mulligan left a car in the garage and it's still there now. The investigators were thrilled, feeling they'd finally found physical evidence in the case. But before they could go check the car, the house phone suddenly rang. So Dawson got up to answer the call. And when he picked up, he heard Mulligan's voice on the other end. So Dawson immediately pointed to the phone, mouthing Mulligan to the investigators. The investigators understood right away. And Dawson gestured that there was another phone in the bedroom. So immediately, one of the investigators went to the room and picked up the second receiver, so he could hear the entire conversation taking place perfectly clearly. But of course, he had to stay quiet so Mulligan wouldn't catch him. So the investigator sat listening to the conversation in complete silence, covering the mouthpiece. Mulligan was asking Dawson on the phone, "Have any FBI investigators come by or contacted you?" So Dawson replied and told him, "No. No one from the FBI has come near me." And here, the investigator knew without a doubt that Dawson was on their side and would help them catch this gang. Mulligan was telling Dawson during the call that the FBI had started asking about him and his associates and tracking the places they'd been. And he told him they were starting to feel anxious and needed him to let them know if anything happened or if any FBI investigator or agent approached him. So Dawson replied and reassured him that he definitely wouldn't say anything, and that he'd get in touch with him right away if the FBI reached him or tried to interrogate him. After that, Mulligan told him, "I want to come over tonight and see you so we can talk for a bit. And then maybe I'll take the car I left with you in the house garage." The investigator, while listening to the call, started to feel afraid. He began to suspect that Mulligan might be setting a trap for Dawson. Maybe he wants to kidnap him, kill him, or do something to him. He might even be watching the house from outside right now and saw their car parked in front of the door. So maybe this whole call was actually just a test for Dawson. So the investigator immediately started thinking and felt that this meeting had to be in a public place. So he took a piece of paper and wrote on it, "Meet him in a public place." And then he gave this paper to Dawson while he was talking to Mulligan on the phone. So Dawson told Mulligan that he would meet him at his favorite restaurant, a restaurant called the Walnut Room, and gave him the exact location of the restaurant. Mulligan agreed to the location, and then they ended the call. After the call, the investigators asked Dawson to take them to the garage, and there they found the car that Mulligan had left behind. The investigators couldn't search the car or force it open because they didn't have a search warrant. And if they forced it open and searched it, that would make any evidence they found inside inadmissible in court. So they had to have a search warrant from a judge. But through the car window, the investigators clearly saw two black gloves exactly like the glove they found in the bank vault. And that alone was more than enough reason for the judge to give them a search warrant for the car. Indeed, they were quickly able to obtain a search warrant, as well as an arrest warrant for Charles Mulligan. And the plan was to arrest him when he met Dawson at the restaurant. And sure enough, night came and Dawson went to the Walnut Room restaurant where he'd agreed to meet Mulligan. And there, the investigators also dressed in ordinary civilian clothes and blended in among the customers in the restaurant and began watching Dawson from a close distance. There were 4 investigators inside the restaurant and 2 others outside, and they were all on standby, ready to step in if anything happened. Protecting Dawson was their number 1 priority. The investigators told Dawson that if he needed anything, he could get up and go to the washroom, and one of them would follow him and meet him inside the washroom to find out what he needed. And vice versa, if one of the investigators went to the washroom, Dawson was also supposed to follow him in case the investigators wanted to tell him something. So the group set their plan and sat at different tables. About an hour later, Mulligan arrived at the restaurant. Mulligan went straight to Dawson and greeted him. And they sat together chatting, and during their conversation, the robbery came up. So Dawson asked Mulligan in a casual tone, saying, "So, do you have a hand in the big robbery that happened?" Mulligan answered him while laughing, "What do you think?" "You think about it," and the conversation between them continued for a while. The investigators couldn't clearly hear what was going on between them. So one of the investigators got up and headed to the washroom, and Dawson knew this was a signal to follow him. So Dawson excused himself from Mulligan and said he was going to the washroom and would be back in a bit. And inside the washroom, the investigator met Dawson and said to him, "Give me an update on what happened between you two. We can't hear clearly from the distance where we're sitting." So Dawson told him, "We didn't talk about anything important." He hinted at the robbery, but he didn't say it explicitly. And now he's in a hurry and wants to leave to get the car from the house garage. The investigator said to him, "Fine, leave the restaurant with him, but don't you dare get in the car with him or let him take you to an isolated place. We'll keep watching you and following from a reasonable distance." What the investigator didn't tell him was that they were going to arrest Mulligan immediately after they left the restaurant. And indeed, Dawson went back to the table and told Mulligan, "Come on, let's go home to get your car." So they left the restaurant together and started walking down the street towards the house. And in a single moment, FBI agents and investigators quickly surrounded them. And they immediately arrested Mulligan. And they also arrested Dawson with him to hide his cooperation. Mulligan didn't resist arrest. But when the investigators tried to talk to him, he refused to answer anything. So now, the investigators put Mulligan in custody, set him aside, and focused their attention on the car he left in Dawson's garage. The investigators began searching the car, and as soon as they opened the trunk, they found a large drill and various digging tools. They found hammers, drill bits, and many other items. And they were almost certain that these tools were used in the robbery. So the investigators cataloged everything they found in the car, and then sent it to the analysis labs. The investigators felt victorious at that time, believing they had truly found a treasure trove of evidence. Of course, these items and tools would take a long time to analyze. Lab experts and technicians needed several days to examine everything thoroughly. So, during this period while the tools were being examined, the investigators decided to follow other leads. Remember the call logs they pulled from the hotel room phone that led them to Dawson? One of the numbers in those logs belonged to a real estate agency. So investigators contacted this agency and asked them about the gang members. A manager working at this real estate agency told investigators she'd rented an apartment to Ronald Barber weeks before the robbery. Ronald Barber, of course, was the gang member who was already in Los Angeles. He didn't come from outside. So he's the one who rented this apartment before the rest of the gang members arrived, and this apartment was on the same street where the bank is located. The manager told investigators that Ronald told her they planned to stay in the apartment for 3 months. But they left the apartment after only 3 weeks. When investigators saw the date they moved out, they immediately realized it was the same date the robbery was discovered, meaning as soon as they finished their operation and the robbery was uncovered, they left this apartment. So investigators immediately began searching the apartment for any traces or evidence the gang members might have left behind. But if we know anything about the members of this gang, we know they're meticulous and don't leave any traces behind. And indeed, the apartment was outwardly clean. And even the surfaces appeared to have been wiped with chemical cleaners. So the apartment didn't seem to have anything that could lead to the gang members. Until the investigators opened the dishwasher. The dishwasher was full, but all the plates and cups inside were unwashed. Not one of the gang members bothered to start the dishwasher. They all forgot to press the start button. And since the dishes were hidden inside the dishwasher, none of them noticed it before they left. This dishwasher was a treasure trove for investigators. They were able to extract fingerprints from the used plates and cups. And these fingerprints were sent to the lab. When the lab technicians compared them to the fingerprints and traces found on the drilling tools they got from the car, they discovered they were a match. And they were able to prove that these fingerprints belonged to 5 of the 7 suspects. The second thing, tool experts were able to match the hammer found in Mulligan's car with the marks on the safety deposit boxes in the vault. And they proved that this hammer was one of the tools used to break open the safety deposit boxes inside the bank vault. Of course, all of this is considered circumstantial evidence. But it was enough to arrest the suspects and begin investigating them. One of these suspects, who is Charles Mulligan, was already under arrest. So now investigators have to find the remaining 6. And they also need to find conclusive evidence to fully convict them. Circumstantial evidence isn't enough. The case still relies primarily on the cooperation and testimony of Earl Dawson, at whose house the meeting took place and in whose garage the car was left. So Dawson was the key witness, and with Mulligan's arrest and the FBI finding the car, the rest of the gang surely knew the FBI was onto them, and that Dawson was cooperating. And indeed, Dawson started getting threatening calls pressuring him to stay quiet and not talk. Dawson didn't know exactly who was threatening him, but this caller was insistent on meeting him to talk face-to-face to discuss the matter. FBI investigators immediately knew this caller wanted more than a meeting, and it was likely the gang wanted to get rid of Dawson and his testimony. In fact, investigators got info from their sources in the larger gang that hitman had been hired to take out Dawson. Of course, as we said, the small gang of 7 who robbed the bank originally belonged to a large gang with direct ties to organized crime and the mafia. And these types of gangs have no mercy for witnesses or informants who cooperate with the police. They move immediately to eliminate them without mercy or negotiation. So the FBI knew the goal of this meeting requested by the unknown caller was to kill Dawson. And of course, the FBI had to protect him by all means, since he was their informant and key witness in the case. So investigators instructed Dawson to arrange a meeting with the caller at the same restaurant where he met Mulligan before. But they didn't tell him the gang intended to kill him. They wanted to confront the killers and send a message to the gang that they were watching them. They would, of course, be at the restaurant monitoring everything. And they were confident they could protect Dawson no matter what, especially since they knew the killers wouldn't kill Dawson in an open or public place. They tried to lure him to an isolated spot. So investigators gave Dawson strict orders not to go anywhere with them and not to leave the restaurant no matter what happened. And as before, if the investigators or Dawson needed to communicate, the meeting place was the washroom. A short while later, these hitmen or potential killers arrived. And there were two of them. They went straight to Dawson. While the investigators watched the scene closely, these two individuals started offering Dawson strong alcoholic drinks. It was clear their goal was to get him drunk. When the investigators saw Dawson getting flustered and nervous, one of them got up and went to the washroom. And this was the signal for Dawson to follow him. So Dawson excused himself from the two men and went to the washroom. There he met the investigator and nervously told him these two men wanted him to leave with them. The investigator told him, "Don't worry, we won't let them take you anywhere. You stay here and we'll deal with them." So the investigator left the washroom, brought the other investigators and confronted those two men, telling them, "We know what your goal is and why you're here. And now it's time to leave." It was a direct confrontation, so those two men had no response. And they got up and left the restaurant without any conflict or words. So this was a clear and direct message to the gang that Dawson was under FBI protection, and that they wouldn't be able to reach him no matter how hard they tried. But of course, that wasn't enough. So to protect Dawson, they had to put him in the Witness Protection Program. The Witness Protection Program, in short, is a federal program whose job is, as the name suggests, to protect witnesses targeted by killers or gangs they testified against. The federal government takes this witness and gives them a completely new identity. They change his name and documents and move him to a new city far from his previous one. And they give him a house and a new life so that the gang or the criminals who were targeting him will never be able to reach him. This program is very important in America because without it, many witnesses or even criminals who want to turn on their associates and gangs wouldn't have the courage to testify against them because they'd be afraid of being killed or the revenge that would come their way. So Earl Dawson was placed in this program to protect him from being targeted by the gang. And of course, he would remain the key witness in the case. Now, the next step was for the FBI to arrest the rest of the suspected gang members. And after all this evidence they gathered, they had search and arrest warrants that allowed them to go after them. So they started looking into the last places or houses where they lived. Of course, all their houses were in the state of Ohio, where they came from, specifically in the city of Youngstown. So the FBI reached their houses and started searching them. And during this search, they received information from their sources or informants inside the gang that these thieves, in many of their robberies, would take the money and bury it underground. And it stays there for a long time, maybe for years, until the investigation into the case is closed down. And then they dig up this money and start the money laundering process. The FBI reached a large piece of land owned by James Dinizio, who is the second member of the gang and the older brother of the gang leader, Emil Dinizio. And they had a strong suspicion that the stolen goods might be buried on this land. So they started the search process, brought their shovels, and even rented excavators and started digging in this land. And the process continued for more than a full week. And finally, after all this time and effort they put in, they found what they were looking for. There were black boxes buried underground. And when they opened them, they found millions of dollars inside, in cash and financial bonds. These boxes didn't just contain the loot from the Los Angeles bank robbery. No, even their previous robberies, almost all their loot was right here. And this was confirmed through the serial numbers on the money. As we said, this gang had been operating for a long time. And before the bank robbery that happened in Los Angeles, they had robbed about 13 banks in the state of Ohio. So imagine, in one fell swoop, the investigators reached most of their loot from all these robberies. And the best part is that they found fingerprints on these boxes. So that's it. The FBI finally had conclusive evidence they could use to prosecute the thieves. Finally, after this complex investigation that lasted for 3 consecutive months, they were able to tighten their grip on the 7 suspects, and they had strong evidence. As for the leader, Emil Dincio, when they went to his house, they found him sitting there as if nothing had happened. He didn't try to run or hide, even though he knew they were after him. According to one of the investigators, if this indicates anything, it points to Emil's confident, arrogant personality that makes him believe he's above the law, and that he can make everything go his way. Anyway, Emil Dincio was arrested very easily. But as for the rest of the gang, each one of them tried to hide or escape in some way. James Dincio, Emil's brother, was arrested at the airport while trying to flee with a bag full of cash from the money they stole. Also, Philip Christopher, the 4th member of the team, was arrested. And they found more than $30,000 of the stolen money in his apartment. So now, 4 of them have been arrested. But all 4 of them remained insistent that they were innocent and refused to cooperate with the investigators. But what they didn't know was that they were about to face a major betrayal. A while later, the police were able to catch the 5th thief, Charles Brockel, the electronics and explosives expert. And the investigators kept pressuring him and showing him the evidence they had, telling him they could put him in prison for a long time. And under this pressure, Charles Brockel was convinced to turn on his comrades, testify against them, and confess to all the details of the operation. In exchange, the investigators would clear him of all the charges against him, and put him in the witness protection program so the gang wouldn't take revenge on him. And that's exactly what happened. And with Charles Brockel's testimony, the case against the gang was fully completed. Now, 5 of the 7 have been arrested. The ones remaining are the brothers Harry Barber and Ronald Barber. When the police went to their house for the first time, they didn't find them. And when they questioned their mother, she said she hadn't seen them or been in touch with them for a long time. It was clear that the brothers had fled and disappeared. And imagine, they tried the defendants they had arrested, while these 2 brothers were still on the run. But within a few months, the FBI received information that the brothers were living in an apartment in New York. And indeed, the police went to that apartment. And when they knocked on the door, Ronald Barber came out. And he was immediately arrested and sent to Los Angeles. All of these thieves received sentences between 15 and 20 years, which isn't considered a harsh sentence because their robbery wasn't violent, and also because most of the stolen goods were recovered. As for the last thief, who is Harry Barber, his brother refused to reveal his location, and for 8 years, Harry remained free and a fugitive from justice. But in 1980, a woman from the state of Pennsylvania contacted the FBI and told them that one of her friends was living with a man who claimed he carried out a big and famous robbery in Los Angeles. And his real name is Harry Barber. She told investigators that this man was apparently trying to live a normal, honest life, and was currently working in maintenance for buildings and homes. The police moved in immediately and found him. And sure enough, this man was Harry Barber, whom they'd been hunting for 8 years. So he was arrested and sentenced to 20 years in prison. And with that, the FBI was finally able to close this case. One of the FBI investigators said the reason the gang got caught was their overconfidence, because they'd pulled off many successful robberies before this one. And even though they were precise and professional in many details, this time they made small but stupid mistakes that led to their arrest. First, of course, they gave the taxi driver a huge tip, so they stuck in his memory. Then, using the hotel phone, which allowed investigators to track their calls. And thirdly, they left their car and tools at Dawson's house. And of course, on top of all that, they forgot to run the dishwasher. They're all trivial mistakes, but together they created clues and evidence that investigators cleverly followed until they solved the case. This case is considered the biggest bank robbery in American history up to that time. And who knows, maybe in the future we'll make a video about the biggest robbery in American history, which actually took place in 1997. That's 25 years after the robbery we saw in today's story. And that brings us to the end of the video. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell icon. And here are some other great clips you can check out. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.